Hi everyone, you're watching The Film Whisperers on Bent TV, a show where two movie nerds talk all things film through a contemporary lens. My name is Matt.
And I'm Sarge.
So Sarge, obviously we speak quite a lot about films on this show, but today we're doing something a little bit different.
Yeah, and I think in particular we've spoken a lot about Australian films. Yep, and I think it's very awesome that today we get to actually meet an Australian filmmaker.
Today we're going to be interviewing incredible Australian filmmaker Aaron Wilson. Aaron works as a director and a writer across film, VR, multi-platform and installation. He's often drawn to narratives that explore human vulnerability and connection between people across countries and cultural divides. And his latest film, Little Tornadoes, is his second feature film and follows a newly single father's efforts to weather the turbulence of change in his life. And that's what we're here to talk about today. So thanks for joining us, Aaron.
Thank you for having me.
So I should start by saying both of us watched Little Tornadoes and loved it. The process of making this film has been kind of a labour of love and also something that's taken quite a bit of time. I think you began filming or you shot it, was it 10 or 12 years ago?
2009, end of 2009.
End of 2009. Yeah. So what was that process like? I mean, going from 2009 to now, I mean, was it all shot back in 2009?
The principal photography was back in end of 2009, so we shot that back to back with my first feature, Canopy. We thought we'd get Canopy finished. It took 2 or 3 years to do post-production on that. Then we premiered at Toronto Film Festival and we travelled the film festival circuit. Meanwhile, a few years go by. And then we thought we'll circle back and get some funding after the success of that to finish this film. And then there were just roadblocks with getting more funding, getting back to do the filming. So I think it took maybe another 3 or 4 years before I can get back to the country to do some pickup shots of particularly the aerial shots and the harvest shots. The harvest needed to happen at a particular time of year. And just over the years, incrementally getting enough money with my day job of shooting commercials to invest in going back and shooting pickups, then more government funding, submissions for applications and looking for new investors. It just took a while.
So at which point did the casting happen?
The casting for the first stage of filming?
Yes.
That was 2009.
I'd like to talk to you about Mark Leonard Winter, who plays the lead role of Leo. Very recently, he was in another TV show called Fires, and again, remarkable actor. And again, he brings his A game into Little Tornadoes as well. Can you tell us what it was like to work with him and what it was like to cast him in that role?
I think I auditioned with my casting director about 8 or 10 people for that role, and Mark stood out from the beginning. I think he was the second person that I saw and thought, this is the person I'm going to circle back to, and it was. He's had a quiet intensity about him, and also the way he listened to what I was saying. I just liked that connection with him from the beginning in the casting session, that rapport, which then spilled over into the shoot once he came on board. He wanted to come up a few weeks earlier onto the filming before the filming began and just immerse himself in the world, because it's a very particular part of the world. It's a small community nestled on the Murray River. And his character works in this factory. He doesn't say a lot. He's quite disconnected from even the community around him. So he wanted to just get a feel for that landscape and get a feel for the people that he'd be working around. So he worked in the factory that we see him in the film for a week before. He just said, I want to go and spend my time in there. And the guys in there taught him how to work the machinery, taught him how to work the lathe. So he was, for all intents and purposes, working in that factory as that character, I guess. And it hasn't changed. That's still the same equipment that has been there for the past 50 years. The film it's been there for at least 80 years, but the film was set 50 years ago. And all that equipment is exactly the same, it works exactly the same.
I think one of my favourite things about the film was actually that there were so many moments where so much was said without any dialogue, and particularly with his character, and actually most of the characters, there were so many kind of like lingering shots on them when they were by themselves, like on their faces and the expressions they were making and even just their posture. And I feel like all the cast really did an amazing job of really conveying so much in saying so little in many parts of the movie as well. You mentioned obviously that you filmed Little Tornadoes just after Canopy, your first film, and I believe that they both are forming a trilogy of films, like going across different generations. Is that right? Of the same family? No?
Oh yeah, something like that.
Well, I was just going to say, sorry, I'm curious, when you were shooting Canopy or when you were kind of writing it, did you already have in mind that you were going to do Little Tornadoes, and kind of did you have it all kind of mapped out, or was it kind of as you were going, it kind of came to fruition?
Not mapped out like it become now. The idea that it was 3 different chapters exploring, I guess, this rural world, this family, and sort of the knock-on effects of trauma down the generations. So it begins with Canopy. It's the birthplace of this trauma. Canopy is effectively a film that's all about where that trauma comes from. It's an experience, I guess. This film is not necessarily connected to, even though it is, but it's the idea of what happens to that character that comes back from war. What does he bring with him? And then how does that affect different generations of his family? So we step into, I guess, the next generation of this sort of country Australian family. How do they deal with that father that's come back and the mum that was told not to ask the father about his experiences? How does that shape that next generation? That's the world I grew up in, and you acutely see these issues facing country Australians. And they were never spoken about, even 70, 80 years later, when you speak to people who were sent to war and came back and their families, they tell you stories that they've never told their wives, they've never told their family. So I guess the absence of communication around the trauma was really intriguing for me. How does that play out in the next generation of that family?
You worked with Christos Cholkis on this. What was that like?
We wouldn't have the film we have without him. I needed a narration to basically balance the lack of voice from our main character, being Mark's Leo. He, as you mentioned, he's very quiet. You feel everything that he's experiencing. You see everything, but you don't hear. He doesn't communicate verbally, really. By contrast, I wanted this voice that spoke about the world and the arrival of the new Italians, that juxtaposed against what we see his journey being. So Christos coming on board was vital in giving, in this case, the character of Maria, into the world, how she viewed this world upon arriving to Australia, this foreign place, viewing characters in this world, but also her sense of place and isolation in this world. And if you parallel her journey against the main male character's journey, you see one and then you hear the other, and they're just quite very different experiences that I wanted to juxtapose together.
From when I guess you shot the film, over a decade ago, do you feel like in the 10 years since, as you're kind of going through all the stages that you mentioned earlier, that it changed quite significantly, or even your feelings towards it changed? Like, do you feel like, the way you saw it in 2009 is different to how you saw it in like 2015 or even closer to now? Like, have you also grown with the movie as well and your kind of view of it, if that makes sense?
Someone asked me a very similar question at a recent Q&A. And I think the film has evolved. There's an essence of the story, the vision and the feeling that I want in there that's pervaded, the iterations of the film. But I think it's kind of like a fine wine aging or a whiskey being distilled, that it shifts and changes as the years go by. So I like to think that the film has taken as long as it's needed to have taken to become the film that it is. Bringing Christos on at the last moment he had such poeticism and a lyrical voice to this narration that we wouldn't have had we finished the film 5-6 years ago. So I think it's very important to have acknowledged that it takes time for things to happen, particularly films in Australia. And I'm grateful that we got to make the film we did with the people that came on board along the way.
And speaking of timing, I feel as if, and I don't want to talk about COVID, but the last 2 years we've been on pause, really. Did that help in any way to get things done behind the scenes?
Or hinder, I don't know.
Oh yeah, or hinder, yeah.
I don't know if it helped or hindered. I think it was a thing that happened, and we just had to react to it. So we had finished all our filming, and I'd finished a bunch of pickup shots up on the Murray with a lot of the kids around town. And I thought, I'm going to shoot some commercials and use that money to pay off what I just spent on the pickups. And then we'll go into post-production. And then COVID happened.
Yeah.
So no commercials, no money. Okay, then adapt. We've got to find new investors. We've got to find new sponsorship to then finish our post. And I had to bring on the narration writer, which was Christos. So I think refocusing, repositioning, how do we move forward? But always with the goal that we've got to get this film done. We were lucky to get some support from MIF, Melbourne Film Festival Premier Fund, from Film Victoria at the time. So that pushed things forward. It got us into post-production, and it allowed us to block out a section to get the film finished. And it gave us a deadline of August last year.
We spoke about it a bit earlier, but given that you first started working on this film back in 2009, I think most people at home might just assume, like, when people are putting films together, that oh yeah, get it done and dusted in a year, send it out into the world, see what happens. For those people, like, I guess, what would you say? I mean, I suppose this obviously took a bit longer. Does it speak at all to, I guess, the film industry here in Australia and how it might differ, for example, from, say, films that get made overseas or, you know, in the US or somewhere like that?
Look, I think it's very hard to make films anywhere in the world. Australia, I can speak to our experience telling a story set in country Australia with my, I guess, perspective as a country Australian and exploring part of our history. It was very, very hard to just mount the production, but also all along the way just to get support to continue to finish the film. So everyone that's come on board, I'm very grateful, but it is really a process of selling your project as you go, continuing in every stage of the production. And that was right through post-production, but even now we're about to launch the film in cinemas and it's still a process. It's still a creative journey. I like to think of this last stage as the last stage in a triathlon. First stage is getting the film funded and getting the script ready. Second stage is making the film and then completing the post-production. And the third stage is taking it to market, getting it out to audiences know it exists, visibility, trying whatever methods you can to just reach audiences, let them know that the film exists. And then they'll make their choice, do they want to see it? But it's just, I've got to continue to be out there talking to people, telling people the film exists.
Usually films that are done in America, they would, and if it's set in the 60s, they would have this set at a studio. Of course, we do not have that luxury here. How challenging was it to recreate that 60s style? There were cars, there were, it almost seemed like some of the town, like the boards were still from the 60s. How challenging was that?
They probably are still from the 60s. I think in part of country Australia, things don't get replaced as much. It's a lot of you using the products that were made a long time ago because they work, so you don't need to waste them. So we actually sourced all the stuff you see locally. There were local businesses, there were museums, and people who loved their cars and were happy to share. That was the philosophy in general. Our production designer had a field day, and our costume designer, they went out and spoke to the locals, went to local flea markets and garages, and found everything that way. It was really engaging the local community and investing in that local community because it's about that world. So we wanted to be involving as many of those people as we could. And then the detail, I guess, the meticulous touch was all down to my production designer and my costume designer, getting things right. We'd constantly talk about things. We'd research. We'd go to people in the town who were in their 70s and 80s and just cross-reference with them. How does this look to you? Does this look authentic?
In terms of the themes that are in the movie, and I know Sarge's quite keen to talk a bit about kind of the post-traumatic effects of war and things like that. But something that I found quite interesting in the film were kind of these littered references to kind of what was happening outside of that town at the time. So like, you know, there would be scenes where my character's listening to the radio in the car and he can hear a news bulletin about, you know, Vietnam War protests. And there was also a scene where I think they were doing like a vox pop on television of women talking about like the female eunuch and feminism. Those inclusions, obviously they were the more overt themes that related directly to the characters, but some of these kind of like contextual clues to what's happening in the 70s and stuff like that. How did you see them relating to the characters in the movie?
I think those elements spoke to what was happening in the background, but they still bled into this world. So I like to think of a small country town as a microcosm of the greater Australian society. Issues that face the country are more, they're felt in the small towns, but it's more pronounced. So when you've got change happening, you've got a community that have to adapt with that change or they'll be left behind. And if you've got people that, you know, communicate in ways that, we spoke before about the trauma, if they've got these traumatic experiences which prevent them from being able to communicate properly or articulate how they feel or seek help, it makes it more difficult for these people to change and shift and adapt. So I wanted to speak to how those greater social pressures affected the everyday lives of these sort of people. Yes, our story is about a family and it's very intimate, but those greater social issues that we hear and feel bleed into their decision-making process and their daily lives.
Was it your intention to shed a light on the post-war trauma with this film?
Definitely. I think that's a legacy that's sort of alive and well in my hometown. And even today, 2-3 generations later, it still exists. There's remnants. And I guess people speak in many arenas around the world about the knock-on effect of trauma from various events. But in this case, the Second World War was a particular event that affected a lot of the men that came back to small country towns. they were told, don't tell your wives what happened because it'll only upset them. And the wives were told, don't ask them because you'll only upset them. So they just didn't communicate about these things. And if you add on to that different elements of trauma, in the case of our film, something happens to his mother. So there's all these things that serve to shift and change our characters, or maybe stunt their growth. That when they're an adult, how do they relate to things? Maybe that trauma, changes the way they might normally have operated. But it's very evident in my hometown. And I wanted to explore not how one person deals with it, but just a feeling of how a community like that has to deal with trauma and the knock-on effects of trauma.
And I think kind of tied into that as well is, in the film, I feel like it focuses quite a lot on, I guess, masculinity and the idea of what it means to be a man in 1970s Australia, country Australia, I should say. And not only for Leo, but also for Tony, who's a recently arrived migrant. Obviously, the film is a snapshot of that time, but do you feel like what it means to be a man in country Australia has shifted over the decades, or do you feel like in some ways there are still similarities?
There are some similarities, but then now I'm having conversations with friends of mine that I grew up with who are talking about these things, or their kids are very verbose at explaining, oh yeah, we talk a lot better about these things than you did, or my dad does, or my grandfather does. But there's still John in my year level who doesn't talk, doesn't communicate. So I think people are a lot more aware and they're able to reach out, and they know there's resources to reach out, but they're also conscious still that there's a very different way that people in country worlds communicate. There's still a high youth suicide in country Australia, much higher than in the cities. There's a lot of markers that point to the fact that work still needs to be done on exploring sort of mental health, particularly in regional areas.
I was quite shocked at to see, which was the scene in the factory where a racial slur is used on one of the characters. And I always wonder when I see scenes like that, what is it like to film a scene that is quite confronting like that? The character that uttered that slur is the sweetest, kindest, most gentle man, and he was struggling with how to say it because he's just a quiet guy. He doesn't get aggressive, so he had to not only say the slur, but he had to get aggressive. So even the act of creating that was a challenge. And then you just see, we didn't tell everyone in the room what was going to happen. We just told him, and then you just see how people react when he yells that line. So that their sort of reactions are authentic. So the actor who was on the receiving end of that he was aware, I'm sure.
He was aware, but then there's about 8 or 9 extras in the room that you see in shot. They're just factory workers who kind of reacted. They didn't know who was going to burst out like that, and they didn't know what he was going to say. So just the aggression, you see the effect of that on the other extras in the room. It's just, you feel it, I guess. And that was important because it's about, he's the antithesis of, I guess, the grandfather character in the film, who he goes internal in terms of his trauma from the war. And the idea is that guy who bursts out, you get a glimpse of him that he's been to Vietnam and he's come back, and he's got a different war trauma that he's come back with, and he has a different way of letting that out. So I just wanted to pepper into this world different people's experiences based upon their own traumas, kind of juxtapose or even mixed in with the fact, yes, there's this racism going on, but it's all very complicated what's happening with these people. It's not so black and white. There's lots of complexities to what's going on with the characters.
Earlier, you obviously touched on the fact that, both then and now in country Australia, there are kind of disproportionate rates of, poor mental health and things like this. I felt like in the film, the location was very much just as much of a character as the actual people in it as well, because there's so many gorgeous shots of the landscape, and it really immersed, I think, the audience into the film. Like, you felt like you were there and you knew exactly what it was like. By making that so prominent, I mean, that was obviously, it's such an important part of the film. By making the location and the setting so important, I guess, what were you trying to highlight about country Victoria beyond, because you said earlier that obviously the story is about, like, it's an intimate story about a family, but more broadly about country, Australia, what were you hoping to kind of impart on audiences?
I think a sense that the world has such an overwhelming presence on the humans that live in it. It's quite a majestical place. It's been inhabited for thousands of years by the traditional owners of the land. And I don't think even people who live in that world appreciate everything about it. People have a strong connection to place, as do I. It's very important. But there's a sense of magic and mystery to that world, which is very strong. I just wanted to capture a bit of that magic and that grandeur, that epicness of the world. And as the day goes on, the sounds shift and change from day to night. It feels different. It can even sound very eerie and haunting and otherworldly. And I wanted that feeling of this character that has different voices and different moods that operates in parallel with the human characters, but also that the characters' individual journeys and troubles and feelings of isolation are probably more pronounced because of what's happening in the background. There's a lot of isolation, physical isolation, and that exacerbates the emotional isolation.
Actually, I was just going to say, I felt like, even though obviously the film is a drama, I felt like there were a number of moments where it felt quite tense and almost shared like sensibilities with like almost, I don't know if a thriller, but I just felt like there were moments where I was really like, oh my gosh, like it was very intense. And so I felt like a lot of that was conveyed through the setting and the isolation and, you know, these amazing shots. And just to clarify as well for our audience, that film was actually shot, I believe, in the town that you grew up in. Is that correct?
It was.
So what was that experience like, you know, shooting a film that you've written or co-written with Christos, and then, you know, having it be in the place where you grew up as well? You obviously have like a personal connection to it as well.
It's very much a personal connection, and to that particular place has a lot of Sicilian and Calabrian people that have come across in the 50s, 60s, 70s, Italian-Australian community that's very vibrant today. That added a lot of colour and texture and life to the world. It still does. And I wanted to speak to that experience, speak to how the new cultural migration, what it brings to the world and the colour and how it affects the world. So in this story, we start on Leo and his factory and his daily life after his wife has disappeared. But as the Italians arrive and become part of his life, the colour palette shifts as well. So we reflect that new, sort of that influx of colour and energy and food into the colour palette. And it's even in the music too. The story, the music shifts in our score from something more suspenseful or kind of like a thriller film.
Yeah, I don't know if that was a fair assessment, but I do know, yeah.
It is a good assessment because I spoke to my composer about this when we began, and I said, I want elements of when the main character's by himself and when he's feeling very isolated. I want to exacerbate that isolation almost to the point of it feeling like a thriller or a horror. Really, back to the landscape, really make it feel like this pervasive character around him that as he's feeling more isolated, it's closing in on around him. And then when he's outdoors and he's feeling happy, it opens up. It's a wide, gentle landscape. And then it's sort of the juxtaposition of these things. And it's the same for the Italians. When they arrive, they bring this colour and we reflect that in the music that we hear on the radio. There's different music. And in the score, it's brighter, it's sort of sweeter. So I like the difference, the balancing and the contrast of these things.
So speaking of that personal connection, how much of your personal experience did you put into this film?
There's a lot of things, from the PTSD of the grandfather to the way the kids grow and shift when they get to experience the new culture that the Italians bring, and they hear it and they can taste it and they can see it in the outfits and the colour. That's something I was very conscious of. I went to friends' houses and their nonnas would be cooking or making limoncello, and there would just be this energy in life that was just very different to other parts of the town, particularly in the food. The process of making things is ritual. This culture, this tradition, which every year it's salami making time, or it's limoncello, or tomato sauce time. You were very conscious of these things, and that was my experience in this world. Probably not for every other Australian town, but that was my town that I grew up in. I wanted to focus on those things and celebrate them as part of who we are as Australians and how we're fortunate to have these things. And Australia, for me, is a small enough country that when the new people come, we don't absorb people. We're small enough that we shift and change and we grow because these new people and their backgrounds bring something they contribute towards our society. It's alive today in the food we eat, in the coffee, in the pastas and in the curries we eat. It's who we are, it's how we identify as Australians, but that also means our culture's constantly shifting and evolving and growing. And that's an exciting thing for me.
Has your family seen this film?
Yes.
What did they say?
My father's a quiet guy. He doesn't say a lot, but I think he really appreciated what I had to say about the world that I came from. It's a respect, I think. It's a respect for that world. Yes, I'm highlighting things that need to be worked on or things that aren't perfect and things that need change, but also at the same time, there's moments of beauty and moments of joy, and it shows that I really have a strong connection to the world I'm from, and I want to be analytical of that, but at the same time respectful.
But when did you first decide that you wanted to pursue filmmaking? So has this been like a lifelong ambition, or is it something, when did you first start getting into filmmaking?
I did photography lots as a kid, growing up on the riverbanks. You'd wander around on hot, blistery days swimming, and then at night time on foggy winter mornings, and photographing that world. So I always liked the way the world looked and felt. But it wasn't until university that I went and studied engineering, which I didn't particularly love. And I escaped that by going to student theatre. And student theatre acting led to directing, then it led to making short films, and it just sort of grew from there. But it circled back to me wanting to explore my hometown world the older I got, and then remembering the photography that I took and finding a lot of those old images and old paintings, and then thinking, oh, this is the canvas that I kind of want to set stories on. I want to delve deeper into those canvases.
Back when you were working on Canopy and then obviously Little Tornadoes, was it really clear from you from the jump that you were like, this is the story that I want to tell, or these are the stories that I want to tell and kind of the things I want to explore? Or was it something that's kind of, it evolved as you kind of went, I started working on them?
Bit of both. I mean, I knew I wanted to focus pointedly on the world that I grew up in, but I think the way I told those stories evolved as, I guess, my filmmaking grew. Looking back on some of my films, they're typically about looking behind closed doors at vulnerability in people, particularly men, and how they react or don't react in some situations. And this is an extension of that. I think it's just evolved that way in the stories that I feel inside that I want to tell. But the world that I want to explore is very obvious. I want to go back to the world that I grew up in, and there's so many great characters and stories and landscapes and textures in that country world that I want to continue making films there.
Just based on what you said about, going back, did you learn anything new about your hometown?
Yeah, always learning. Learning about myself in the process. I think filmmaking for me is a way of, I'm very hyperactive and always got something going on in my head. But films are a way of slowing down the way I look at the world and looking at details with greater clarity, small details, just little mundane elements of life. Now, I think going back to make this film in the research, just exploring things that I'd perhaps overlooked or things I took for granted, or doing the research and speaking to people and finding a different angle on something that I already knew, but just it sort of enhanced the importance of that. And even just now, doing the release of the film and going back to my hometown, everyone's excited about seeing the film, but you just extend your networks a little bit further and you're bringing people closer and you're hearing more stories or more connection to each other. Oh, that's like my family. Oh, that's like my grandfather or my uncle or my brother. You're realizing more of a connection between each other, and that's an important thing. I guess I'm interested in what are the stories that connect us? What are the stories that bring us together? And what's an experience that can make us more inclusive as a people moving forward?
You mentioned earlier a bit about like the way the film industry is and how like outside of maybe Hollywood, it can be quite a process to put something together and get it out into the world. But do you feel like, that's something that's missing in terms of like the kinds of films we get to see here in Australia about like country life here in Australia, what that's like, from multiple perspectives, is that kind of almost not a gap, but something that you were hoping to kind of bring to audiences so that they could kind of just see a kind of a new perspective about what your experience is like also growing up?
Yeah, not so much a gap. I think there's great stories set in regional Australia, too numerous to mention, but I think I wanted to focus on my experience and how that is just different. In doing that, what that storytelling, how it contributes towards the landscape of Australian cinema. I guess my way of looking at film is slow things down, focus on the small details, and how do those details connect to us all on a universal level. So I wanted to sort of go back to the base level of family, and then beyond that community, and on a greater level, how do the things around us in society affect those communities and families in that particular world I'm setting the story.
As I guess a queer filmmaker, obviously the film Little Tornadoes is not explicitly queer, but there is a scene that kind of suggests that one of the characters, Tony, actually might be gay. I guess how did your experience growing up in country Australia as a gay person influence the film or the story?
There's a lot of me in all of those characters, particularly the main character. Set in 1971, you've got a 30-year-old Australian male who doesn't really know how to communicate that well with anyone. What would my life have been like if I was born in that era and I hadn't left the town? You're unable to express who you really are, you're unable to come out. lots of things sort of inhibiting your growth. I mean, yes, take the PTSD element. Then you take the fact that he's got these other traumas that the film slowly reveals and explores. It just hinders the growth of this individual, and you can see why he is like he is. I always think, well, what would happen if I did stay in that world? And you know, so I kind of look inward at how would I feel in this situation? What might I do when I was writing the character and when I was talking to Mark?
Did you cast many people from the town as extras?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah, we did quite a bit.
Did you know them?
Some I did, yeah. So the guy in the factory who utters the slur,
Yeah.
I went to school with him. He was my
Wow.
friend from school.
Right.
And he was working in that factory at the time.
Okay. Right.
So-
So he was not a professional actor. He was
Not a
just
professional. He was just a great screen presence. But then all those guys you see in that lunchroom, they're not actors, apart from our main two actors. They're non-actors. That was their first time. There's, I think, 3 or 4 women in various scenes throughout the film. They're non-professional actors. We did casting in a local drama society.
Wow.
And I remember seeing the little plaques with their names and their ages and just picking people that I thought would fit well in the town. And then there's also little vignettes we went back and shot years later in the pickups. And that was about me capturing the feeling of the greater community that our main character passes in the street, but he doesn't really connect with. He's sort of isolated. But I wanted to glimpse elements of that life just taking place. So like you mentioned before about the social change in the background, kind of even closer, what's the change that's happening around him on the streets? Those scenes were all filmed with people from the town. Sometimes my family, my nephews are in some of those shots. So it's just little elements of life happening with people who are actually from that town doing what they would normally do on a summer's day.
How, I guess, does your relationship with Canopy, and maybe it's like, you know, they're obviously your darlings, but like, how does your relationship with the two films differ, I guess? Like, do they diverge quite significantly, or do you both kind of see them as one in a way?
The companion pieces, I'd say. Canopy is this experience, this feeling, and then this next film, Little Tornadoes, is the knock-on effect of that experience. Very different structures to where they're made. This is probably more traditional in the way it's structured. But I really wanted to focus on the nostalgia and the reflection on who we were 50 years ago and the problems that we were facing, but then parallel that with what's happening today in the world. There's still issues and people, there's a disconnect between people, and there's a lot of great social change happening, and how do we work with that and negotiate that together as a people?
So I probably should have asked this at the start, but I've been very curious. So why did you decide to call it that? Why did you call it Little
good question.
Tornadoes?
You know those little whirly dusts that you see
Yeah.
in the country that
Yeah.
just pop up out of nowhere, and they dust. I think they're called dust devils as well, or willy willies. Dust devil's not a good title for a film, but a little tornado. It's just little disturbances that happen in life. They pop up out of nowhere. They cause a bit of stir in the paddock. They take some topsoil off and disappear. But I like the idea that it's reflective of little things in life that pop up that are disturbances, and collectively they form an understanding of life happens, but along the way there's little things that get chucked at us and we've just got to deal with it. And that sort of can do, I guess, get on with the attitude is very much a country Australian philosophy, modus operandi. So I thought it was a nice kind of visual connection to the story.
As you mentioned, that both Canopy and Little Tornadoes are companion pieces. I believe are forming kind of loosely part of a trilogy. And I know it's early days, but have you begun to think about like your next move, like the next film you're going to work on?
I don't know if this will be my next film, but there is an idea for a third chapter to the film.
Yeah.
And it explores, it's set today, and it explores an element of that family today. And yes, there is a queer element to that character in that story. And that's probably even closer to my heart as well. But it's very early days.
Yeah.
It's hard to make films in general. Right now, it's just writing and creation stage.
Little Tornadoes has been screened. Like last year, I believe it was at a Perth Film Festival to be screened, which was great. I think it got a screen for a little bit at MIF as well. What has your response been so far? Like before the proper big like kind of theatrical release, what has the response to the film been so far?
A lot of great feedback from people who are from country towns or from regional Australia, or whose family comes from regional Australia, and families who are new migrants. Just the experience of the juxtaposition that happens in the film, the connection to place, the racism, and the social change happening in the background. I think I got a lot of messages, particularly from women in their 40s, 50s and 60s, reflecting on their life, reflecting on their connection to family and place. And also people brought their own expectation, their own sense of self to the film and kind of put themselves in that situation based upon their own experiences. That was interesting.
Where can we see, where can the people see Little Tornadoes?
12th of May is when we have our theatrical release across Australia. And it's a small film, so we're slowly bringing on new cinemas as we go. But because we're small, we have a very limited publicity budget. So the best way to get the word out is we just let people know, share news of the film with your friends. We're on Instagram. We've got an Instagram page, Little Tornadoes Film, and you can find out more about the film there. You can request screenings. You can see where the film's being screened. But mostly it's about sharing news that the film exists, check out the trailer, and then share it with your friends. Or even let your cinema know. If it's not coming to your town, let your cinema know. Because the reason cinemas, the way that cinemas put films on is by hearing demand for that film. And pre-sales, if we can get people to pre-book tickets for sessions, to let cinemas know, oh, there's demand in the community to actually see this film, let's book it in or keep it on longer. So that sort of stuff, that grassroots stuff is very important for Australian films, especially when American films or European films have much bigger budgets, not just filming, but big budgets to market in Australia. So we've got to compete with that. We've got to have cut through. So what's our point of difference? For me, it's more of an emotional sell, how to empower our friends and friends of friends and our greater film community to spread the word and share news of the film.
And will you screen it at the town that you filmed it at?
Yes, we're screening in the hometown a few times. We've got a big gala in Cobram on the Murray River. They've got a twin cinema. Wow. So we'll be inviting members of the community down, council, people who are in the film, and bringing some stars in from Sydney and from Melbourne, just to make it a big lavish event that really is about, like the film, it just brings people together. It speaks about that inclusiveness and really just celebrating that as an event.
Well, Sarge and I have both obviously seen Little Tornadoes, and it's a beautiful film. Congratulations. It's really just incredibly moving. Yeah, it's amazing, and everyone should definitely go and see it when it comes out. So May 12th will be the theatrical release date, so definitely check it out in a cinema near you, or if it's not screening at your cinema, make sure to let them know so that hopefully they'll screen it and more people can see it. But thank you so much today for joining us, Aaron. So we've been speaking today to Aaron Wilson, Australian filmmaker, whose new film, Little Tornadoes, will be out on May the 12th. So thank you again so much for being with us today. And yeah, we'll catch you next time on Bent TV, where the film is.